Okay, so hello, church. It's good to be with you once again. I am Zach, and I am going to be doing your Bible class for this morning. So I hope that you guys are enjoying your Sunday morning, bit of this cooler weather, maybe a bit of coffee, maybe outside. This is a nice way of enjoying church. I look forward to being with you all, but it's a fun, different format that allows for different things. And I hope that this lesson will be interesting, perhaps a bit entertaining, and well, actually, that's asking too much, but interesting, hopefully, nonetheless. But I'm really excited to get to work with you, or to get to kind of teach what I'm going to teach today, because I found it to be very helpful, particularly for the people who've been coming through Christianity 101. So I'm going to share it with the church today. What we're going to do this morning is we're going to walk through a history of the Bible. Not really the whole Bible, that would take far too long. And because that's history is sort of stretching from the beginning of time up until 2020. But what we're really trying to do is get a firm grasp of the timeline of events of what's going on in the Bible and kind of where the various books of the Bible, characters of the Bible, and people of the Bible interact with those events. Because I've found that when we open our Bibles and try to read them, um, it usually starts off pretty strong in Genesis when it's a lot of stories, and then Exodus, it's pretty exciting through a few stories, and then we get about midway through Exodus, and you get some of the laws, and it gets a little harder, and then you get the explanation for the tabernacle, and it's you start to lag a little bit, and maybe you keep pushing through, get all the way to Joshua, where Numbers has some exciting things. Balaam's donkey is always a great story, but regardless, you get to Joshua where it kind of hops back into story, and you can get Joshua and Judges, and it's all this story. Ruth is awesome, and then you have First and Second Samuel, these great stories of David and all of his stuff. And then you get to this long list of kings who are all judged based on David. If I said Daniel earlier, I was wrong, but David and all of his stories. Then you get all these kings who are mostly bad. Some of them are good, and then Israel gets exiled. And then you hop into this prophetic literature where you're like, don't know who half the characters are, don't know who the various emperors, or it's not emperors, entities being described. So who are the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Hittites, the Jebusites, the whateverites that are going on, the Egyptians. Egyptians are called Egyptians, they're called Cushites, they're called Mithranites sometimes. Like, you have all these different names, and you can get a little bit lost. And so I find that occasionally all of that data makes the Old Testament in particular difficult to handle. And the same is true up in the New Testament. You end up with, you have Jesus's story. Well, you have 400 years between Old Testament, New Testament, and you turn the page from Malachi to Matthew, and no one explains to you, hey, 400 years have passed, and there have been two revolutions within the people of God. There are all these new characters, like new groups of people, like the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Oh, and King Herod is this figure that everyone seems to know about and whatnot, but it just kind of assumes that you know that. So you have to, it's a whole different world. Rome is superior. Rome happened. That was a big deal for world history and whatnot. And then hop into the New Testament, and you read through the Gospels, read through Acts, and these are all the stories, and you kind of get what's going on. It's really great. Then you get all these letters, and these letters are very specific, talking to specific groups of people in specific times and places. And the context of those letters can sometimes, it's sometimes hard to figure out what those letters have to do with the story. Um, all of that being said, there's a lot of information, and I found that our brains work really well if we think about it in a somewhat chronological order. It's just super helpful. I think that, I'm not sure if that's how God wired us, because other cultures don't think that way, but that's definitely how our culture has conditioned us, and that's okay. And so we are a people who like to figure out where things happen and the sequence of events so we can feel a little bit more at home with them. And so I want to try to provide at least a sketch timeline of where we are. We're going to be focusing on the Old Testament, because I got a request. A couple of people asked for the timeline that I put up. Let me share my screen really quickly. The timeline that I put up, here we are, right here. This was for last lesson. If you saw the lesson with Elijah, We went through this time, we used it very briefly, but a few of you actually asked me if I could email you that picture because it sort of lays out all the kings of Israel in a very helpful manner. And so it got me thinking that maybe this would, walking through some of this timeline stuff would be helpful for some of you, or maybe just a good refresher to think about this as you read your Bible and see where you're at. So jumping into this, I don't want to get, there's a lot to talk about, and we're not going to cover all of it, and I'm probably going to miss some of your favorite parts, and I apologize if that's the case. But where do we begin is actually a pretty important question, and it's a interesting one when you think about it. When does the Bible start? If we're trying to do Bible history of some way, when does the Bible start? Well, you might think, and you'd be absolutely crazy to think this, but it might start at page 1. In the beginning, God, created the heavens and the earth. Earth was formless and void, Genesis 1:1. Well, that's true, that creation started with God speaking and Jesus and all of that stuff. But the Bible didn't actually start at creation. The Bible actually, this slide's, I skipped it, whatever. The Bible actually started with Sinai. It started with Israel at Mount Sinai and God giving the law to Moses. Now, all of our pictures depict that Moses carried these 2 stone tablets and he broke them. And those tablets had the 10 words or the 10 commandments written on them. And I'm not saying that's wrong. Like that's kind of the way that we think about that. But ultimately, what we believe as Christians, and what the Jews believe, actually, if you're an Orthodox Jew, is that God spoke to Moses and gave him the Torah at Sinai. And how the God giving versus Moses receiving and writing down and all of that stuff is a whole different subject that could take a very long time. But we believe that that's what God, that God and the Holy Spirit was specially involved in the crafting of the Torah, and that happened at Mount Sinai. That's, or at least it began there. That's where the law was given, and then over the 40 years of Israel spent in the wilderness, like that's, the story unfolded, and Moses had a significant portion in writing that down. And then we're pretty sure that later editors probably did at least part of it, because it'd be weird if Moses wrote about his own death before walking up and dying. That's in Deuteronomy. But all of that, again, is in the weeds. I think it is important for us to remember, though, that the Bible did start at Sinai, which means that Genesis, the book of Genesis, is retrospective. So when God is telling the stories of Adam and the stories of Noah and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, when the people of Israel are hearing these stories, when Moses is telling them these stories, I think absolutely they had some sense of this. These were their ancestors and this is where they came from. But in another sense, they had spent 400 years living within Egypt, and living within Egypt, which was the most powerful empire of the world. And when you live in the most powerful empire in the world, it is so easy to just adopt their stories as the way that the world works, especially if you're a slave and you don't have all that much control over your life. So a big part of the Exodus, so the first half of the book of Exodus is God getting Israel out of Egypt. Well, then the second part of Exodus, and really the rest of the Torah, is about God getting Egypt out of Israel. He had to teach them who they were. He had to teach them how they were his children and what they should do and what they shouldn't do. One of my favorite lines that I've ever read written about, it was a commentary on the book of Exodus, and it was talking about why there were all of these weird laws that were governing like the way that the Israelites dressed, the way that they ate food, the way that they did all of these things. And he had an interesting perspective. He said that God was giving these laws to a people who were a slave people. And a slave people has a memory of being a slave people long after they get their freedom. They're told by everything in society, like overtly and and covertly, that they matter less than everyone else around them, that they don't matter at all. Well, imagine hearing a God cares about what you wear, and a God cares about how you do your crops, and a God cares about how you treat your neighbors and how you eat. Everything in your life has value and matters, and God cares about it. So some of the laws could have been a way of God teaching his people that how not to be slaves, that their actions have value and significance, that they aren't insignificant. Another thing in the weeds. All that to say is that it's an interesting way of reading the book of Genesis to imagine being a person at Mount Sinai, a person who's come out of Egypt and is learning about who they are. It makes me feel close to those people. It makes me feel, because I didn't experience any of the biblical events firsthand, but I join a long history of people who have heard from witnesses about the deeds of God, and written them down and passed them along. And I join in that, and I can see myself in that story. And so I really appreciate that. This is just quick thing before we hop into the deal. This is the longest introduction ever. Cool way to organize your Old Testament. You should organize it by 5 covenants. And this is from Sandra Richter's Epic of Eden. I highly recommend the book. So 5 covenants: Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, David. Those 5 covenants really define the Old Testament, and they really help us to put a shape to the story that's being told throughout the Old Testament, a story that comes to its climax in Jesus. And so I don't want to go into it much further there, but it's helpful to think, okay, Genesis 1-3, we learn about humanity and what Adam means mankind in Hebrew. So what is God's relation to humanity? Well, they're made in the image of God, and they're supposed to do productive work, and there's the Sabbath given to them, so they have this rest, and all of that has meaning and significance as the story carries on. Well, Noah. Well, God made a covenant with Noah. And a covenant is like a contract, but it's like more than a contract. It's this promise that God makes to people. But it was a secular institution. A covenant in the ancient world it was very similar to a contract. It was just kind of a deeper and more lasting thing. However, Noah, God made a covenant with Noah in order to, so God uses a covenant to show us people that he's going to be faithful to his word. So he makes a covenant with Noah, and that's the rainbow in the sky, and it's the idea that God's not going to destroy the earth with water, which was a big deal to people who lived in a world where water was the ultimate primeval chaos. Water was the symbol of chaos in the ancient world. And so this meant a lot more to them than it does to us, but it's the idea that God is going to hold the laws of nature constant until he comes back is sort of this notion with Noah. Then we move into the Abraham, the covenant with Abraham, which is where things get very particular. He grabs one man and he says, I'm going to make you a great nation. I'm going to bless you. All peoples on earth are going to be blessed through you. I'm going to give you a land and a place and a name, and you're going to be my guy. And from your family, I'm going to rescue the world. And that's this promise that God makes with Abraham. And it's very significant. And then we move to Moses. And this is kind of almost a covenant renewal of the Abraham covenant. But it is the covenant, it's made in the book of Exodus when the people come out of Egypt. Moses reads to them God's words, and then he sprinkles them with blood, and they eat a feast, which is kind of the way that these ceremonies were intact. It's almost like sprinkling it with blood and eating a meal is basically the notary public signing your contract. So this is how this thing worked, that God was entering into a marriage relationship with Israel, that they would be his people and he would be their God. And Deuteronomy, the latter half of Deuteronomy, blessings and curses really go into that in more detail. But this is the Mosaic covenant that is kind of where the Torah comes from and all of that. And then finally, the covenant God makes with David, and that's the promise of kingship and dominion, which is the idea that someone from the house of David will reign on the throne forever, will eventually. And this is our messianic hope. This is our hope that Jesus is going to come back and rule the world and set all things to rights. And so that is the story of the Old Testament. If you think about it through those stages, you can kind of put some almost some guardrails around it to think about, okay, this is the story that's being told. This is my organizational system. So there's a helpful little tip. All right, Old Testament timeline. We're just going to walk through this for the rest of the time. I'll make a few comments at the end. We'll probably go on a couple of excursions, and then, hey, there we go. We'll be done. So if you noticed, I have put a bunch of boxes here. This is because I'm not good at graphic design at all. And so I didn't make my own timeline. I Googled Old Testament timeline and I looked through video, like, well, actually, Pinterest had a lot of these, which was kind of neat. And I found one, and this one I liked more than all the others. However, I don't like that it did a specific thing. These dates right here that I left unblocked, they have specific dates assigned to every single event that goes on right here. And I don't think that's the most helpful way for us to approach this because, well, ultimately we don't know. And I don't want you to hear from me because I really believe the Bible. Um, However, I believe that our goal when we're reading scripture is to try to understand what the original author was intending by what he or she wrote and what the original audience heard and understood. So, for instance, if I am talking to a group of people from College Station, Texas, and I say, howdy. Well, no one said it back because I'm alone in my office right now. However, there is an expectation that is a culturally embodied expectation that that group of people will respond howdy and then they'll be quiet because that's how classes started. And that there's enough Aggies here that it's kind of permeated the culture, and that is something that we do, and it's really neat. Now, if I were to take that same statement and go to a group of people in my hometown of Austin, Texas, they would look at me like, who's the country blumpkin saying howdy randomly? That's kind of weird. Or I don't know what they would say, but that's something they might think. Anyways, just this idea of communication is something that really has localism. It has something very particular to it. And so if you think about that concept and then apply it to the idea of time, then you have to realize that ancient peoples did not think on a numerical calendar in the same way that we did. Therefore, because of that, the way that they relate to numbers and dates and times, they're much more interested in what happened and the significance that numbers play in a story than what was the exact date or the exact number of people. So what I'm basically trying to argue is that most numbers in the Old Testament are estimates. That is true, and that is fine, and that is not the Bible being deceptive in any way, because all of its original hearers understood that. It wasn't like I was saying 600,000 people left Egypt at the Exodus, and I told that to my audience, assuming that they would believe that I thought that 600,000 did that. If I say 600,000, they think, oh yeah, a whole big bunch of people. That's kind of how their mind works. And many, many times, numbers have theological significance as much as they have numeric significance. Now, so for instance, like 40 in not only the Bible, but other ancient documents that we have, 40 years is a man's life. It's a generation. So that is just a common convention that they'll say. I hope this isn't getting too complicated, but what I'm trying to tell you is that the further back you go in the timeline, the less certain we can be about how exactly the dates work. And so when it comes to Samuel, 1121, 1020 BC, and the kings, the thing is that written language at this point had become diverse enough and in enough different areas. So in Mesopotamia and in Egypt, and also in Israel area, that we have enough other written documents that it's very easy for us to, it's a lot easier for us to figure out when stuff was, what dates various things happened, because we can compare it to other places. The further back you go in time, the less people actually used written language. Now, Egypt is the first to adopt, the first to adopt a form of written language in hieroglyphics. The first script was Sanskrit, and all of these things happened a long, long time ago. But to kind of think about when you're dealing with ancient history, written language was a technological development. And if people didn't write stuff down, we here in the 21st century have no way of knowing when it happened, or we have, well, not no way of knowing. The way that we can kind of figure it out based on the Egyptian, ancient dating and archaeology is done through pottery. And so you look at the style of pottery, and we can associate the style of pottery in Israel versus the style of pottery in Egypt, where we have written codes and languages. And then we can make a rough guesstimate on how old this various area in a tell, which is a hill fort, is. Not a hill fort, just a mound of civilization. Getting in the weeds. Apologies about that. But what I'm trying to tell you is that everything before, say Samuel, there's not a lot of written records. Israel is basically a tribal group. They're not a sophisticated place with royal scribes who are writing stuff down. They're a desert nomadic people who are moving around, and then they're settling in the new land. They conquest, they start to settle, and they're disparate tribes who are kind of arguing with each other, kind of working together, sort of the period of the judges. There's very few records being kept. And because there's very few records being kept, it's hard for us to know exactly when things happened. And the internal evidence of the Bible doesn't date things for us. It doesn't tell us, well, then in 1125, this happened here. The one date that we have in 1 Kings chapter 6 that this timeline that I kind of blurred some stuff out on uses is in 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1. It tells us, in the 480th year after the Israelites came out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, in the 2nd month, he began to build the temple of the Lord. Okay, so the 480th year, we can use what we know about Solomon's reign, and then you can add 480 years back to that and backtrack, and you get a date of the Exodus around 1430 BC, somewhere around there. And so that is one of the dates that people will say this is when the Exodus happened. I'm not totally opposed to that. I just don't know if we can be that certain. The reason is because it is 480. And 480 is 40, which is a number that is commonly used as kind of an estimate of time, times 12. 40 times 12 is 480. And the 12 tribes of Israel is a symbolic number that is of symbolic importance. And so it is very possible that the author here is trying to say the perfect amount of time. 12 generations after the Exodus, the temple was built. See how perfect it is? 12 generations. And I think it very well could have been, and probably was, 12 generations. So it's 12 generations afterwards, but each generation wasn't exactly 40 years. It was give or take this or that, whatever. So again, this is the way that my mind works, is that if I want to understand how the author of Kings is trying to use numbers. And if you want to say, if the way that you think leads you to say, all right, we just roll with that, we'll do the 1450s when the Exodus happened, that's fine with. I don't think that is wrong. I think there are plenty of very smart, intelligent, faithful Christians who follow that path. I would not make a biblical chronology like a test of faith to say, well, if you don't believe that this is not the line in the sand that we draw and say, on this side of the line are believers and on this side are a bunch of heathens who've copped out to the world of science. Like it's not the line that we should draw. One of my go-tos as far as talking to people about the faith or teaching new believers is this idea of, I forgot what the idea was. Goodness, I'm getting all mixed up. Oh, don't ever tell someone that they have to believe something unless that's what the Bible tells you. We shouldn't if the Bible tells us that we need to believe something, that's great. We should believe it. That's because it is our source of understanding of what God's word is and all that. But let's make sure to not add stuff onto that, that the Bible may or may not say. We got to be careful readers. Back to the weeds. So hopping into this, when you look at right here, we have the Exodus, okay? And then this whole period is Moses, and we have the Mosaic covenant that's going on in this era right here. We know, like we said, somewhere around the 1400s BC is where we're rolling right here. This is when God really made himself known to the world. think that's a really significant event, that God chose to announce himself to the world by destroying the most powerful empire that there was. The world was going to hear about that. They were going to hear about these Israelites, and God was ultimately trying to rescue the entire world through Israel. And so that makes absolute sense that God would make such a public announcement to the world. And then, so this is where we have the Moses stuff. And then if you've read your book, they wander in the wilderness for about 40 years. And then we have Joshua and the conquest of the promised land. Now, that's the Canaanite conquest happened with Joshua. Again, we're somewhere in the 1400s ish, maybe early 1300s. And Joshua conquers, they execute a bunch of battles, and they conquer the 7 wicked nations, the Jebusites, Hittites, goodness, I don't remember all 7, but there's 7 nations that's described. It's said like 15 times in Joshua. And they conquer them all. However, they don't conquer them entirely. And that's a big deal, because the whole idea is that Israel would push them out, and then they would live in this crossroads of the world as the people of God, and they wouldn't go to the pagan ways. Earlier, before when God's kind of last words with Abraham is that his people would go down into slavery, and that because for 400 years, because the sin of the Amorites had not reached its full measure. So God was going to give them 400 years to repent, and if they didn't repent, then the conquest would happen. And so God used Israel as a tool to punish the wicked nations. He drove them out, and Israel took over. Now, in Joshua, it's described as if Joshua won all these battles. He was a great general. He conquered all these people, and then the Israelites settled. But then in Judges, we see that all of these nations are kind of coming back, and they're sort of developing back around. Well, this is another one of those instances where it tells us that, Joshua's army put everyone to the sword. Well, it kind of means everyone who is there and present. So if you are in an ancient city and an army comes marching up, you can hide behind the city walls, or you can run away. So a lot of people probably ran away, and then Joshua won the battle. And then because the Israelites didn't have enough people to like garrison all these cities, well, those people who ran away after the Israelite army moved on, they just kind of come back and pick them back up. And that's what created all these problems in the era of the Judges, where we have these cycles. And in the era of the Judges, there's sort of this declining cycle where in Ehud and Deborah's day, Israel was doing pretty good as far as keeping God's covenant. But by Samson's time, even their leader was an awful person who murdered people for fun. And so we start with this cycle of Israel is faithful and it's good, and then they forget their covenant, and then an enemy oppresses them, and then they cry out for repentance, and God raises a judge, and they push the enemy away, and then the people forget God again after they get prosperous. And so it just sort of descends down. At the very beginning of the book of Judges, we have this statement: now there was no king in the land, so everyone did what was right in their own sight. And then at the end of the book of Judges, we lead into Samuel right after Judges, where we have the story of the king, of the beginning of the monarchy. And so that's kind of this. Judges is sort of almost an apology for, not like an apology in the sense of a defense of the monarchy. It's saying like, this is why we need a king, because whenever there's no king in the land, everyone does what's right in their own eyes. And you may be thinking, but wait, didn't God say that the people rejected me as king because they picked a king? That's true, but it's not because they got a king just in general. It's because they picked the wrong king. In Deuteronomy, God talks about how a king will be necessary, and the king needs to be a person who will write down this book and read it every day and be my person. So that's just a little fun historical note. But we have this stuff with Samuel, Saul's reign, and David's reign, and Solomon's reign. And this is the United Kingdom. And this right here is the greatest period of Israel's dominance in the world. I want to take a pause for just a moment right here and tell you a little bit about what's going on outside of Israel, because most of you are probably pretty familiar with this timeline. Some of you may or may not know what's going on around Israel at the time. Now, a big thing that I've learned through studying Old Testament stuff in detail is I've learned that I had too big of a view, kind of too grand of a scale of what's going on in Israel. Whenever I thought about um, when I thought about the events in the Bible and these battles, I'm picturing Lord of the Rings, Return of the King, all these armies covering the landscape and horses and chariots and all this stuff. I didn't realize, one, how small Israel is, just land mass wise, how small that area, that strip of land is. And then two, how big of a deal Assyria, Babylon, and Egypt were. Israel was never, at any point in its history, a significant empire on a grand scale. God says several times throughout the Old Testament that it's not because of power or might that he chose them, but they were the weakest of the nations, and God chose them because he chose them and because he loves them. I used to kind of read over that, and I would believe it because it's what the Bible said, but then in my mind, it's like, yeah, whatever, but like, I didn't really appreciate that God was not exaggerating. They were a weak nation. They were um, a a minor annoyance to the big fish of Assyria, then Babylon and Egypt. And most of their history after this united kingdom, they will spend paying tribute to either the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, or Egypt, or they'll be destroyed by them. So they were never this autonomous. The only era in their history where they were kind of autonomous and on the ascendancy was this United Kingdom period, and really David and Solomon's reign. That was where they kind of had their most political power. After this, it all sort of goes downhill in terms of, well, both theologically and politically. That is something that helps me when I'm reading to kind of realize and understand that God is making himself known through a people who were not politically strong. I live in America. Most of you who watch this video live in America, which is the dominant empire of the world. So we are used to the idea of our culture setting the tone for the world's culture. That's kind of how it goes, because where the power and money is, that's where people will start to go. Like, they go to power and money like a moth goes to flies. That's just how the world works. And so other nations tend to adopt American style dress and American popular music and American whatever movies and music and things like that. That's not to say that other cultures don't produce those. They absolutely do. But if you look at it, there are a lot of people who sort of imitate and gravitate towards America. And that was the same is true in previous eras of history as well. So when Egypt is the biggest thing in town, Egypt is the civilized world. And if you look at some of the archaeology we have in the Philistine places, Philistia copies Egypt's style of dress. They copy a lot of their gods. They copy a lot of this stuff because, Egypt's the big boy, and they want proximity to power and be like the powerful and the people in. The same thing is true with Assyria and Babylon, who are the next empire. So this United Kingdom period actually happened when Assyria had not yet become an empire. So Assyria is north of Israel. It's in Mesopotamia. They had not yet developed outside of just they were all infighting at this point. A bunch of little tribes fighting each other, a couple of powerful leaders, but nothing really got going as far as a big nation state type thing as we could conceive of it. And Egypt had hit a super big decline, and they were also infighting. They were it's this middle kingdom period where they're trying to figure out who's in charge and who they are, and a lot of stuff was going bad. There was internal division. And because those two empires were struggling, that gave David and Solomon the ability to expand and profit from that. After David and Solomon, in the period where, goodness, I'm stressed out just looking at this, but during all of this period with all these guys, we have the Assyrian Empire, which lasted from 810 to 605. The Assyrians became on the ascendancy, and pretty much from that point on, Israel did not have any autonomy. Now, obviously, they could self-rule to a certain degree, but they were paying a large tribute each year to the Assyrian Empire from this point. And then Judah was paying off the Babylonian Empire. And then around here, the exile period, they decided, ooh, let's make a partnership with Egypt and we'll stop paying our taxes and revolt because we're sick of paying taxes and Egypt's going to help us out. And it didn't work out very well, and Judah was smashed. So that's what happens here. I will not go through each one of these kings, but you can see that in the northern kingdom, we had a short-lived kingdom that got destroyed by Assyria in 722 BC. It's a very important date for you to remember. This is when the northern kingdom falls. It will be on the test. And then the southern kingdom falls on 586. The southern kingdom, or the kingdom of Judah. And this is where the line of David, a different line, the line of Jeroboam, not of the house of David, took on right here and was eventually snuffed out. But then Rehoboam was the son of Solomon, who was very dumb. But then all of these guys kind of came out. And if you read the book of Kings and the book of Chronicles, what you're going to see is a list of kings, and you're going to see them judged. They're graded based on, actually, it's very interesting. It's pretty unique in the writer. Typically, when you look at chronicles that are written of kings, they're going to be fairly complimentary of the kings. It is not common for critical history was not common in the ancient world at all. The way that you read, if you're reading the Assyrian Chronicles and you see nothing said about a battle, or you see something that's less effusive in its praise, they probably lost the battle. If you read the histories of the Assyrian Empire and the Babylonian Empire, their leaders never lost a battle. They always won. It's kind of like our jokes about the North Korea. And if you read some of the crazy, like Kim Jong-un had 18 hole-in-ones at the Masters and won it on his own. Like, it's like that. It's that effusive in its praise. But the Book of Kings is very comfortable saying this guy was good and this guy was bad. And they did not judge it how we would judge effective governance, which is, well, is the economy good? Are few pet issues good? Are you operating morally or whatever? Well, actually, the morally thing doesn't. That's a bunny trail. I'm gonna stop there. But what they really ask is, did they follow God's covenant, and did they get rid of the idol worship, and were they, leading the people towards God? That's pretty unique, especially in the world history scale, because writing was expensive at this time, and the kings often had the money, and the kings often were the only ones who had enough to pay a writer. So some writer decided to keep and write this work because it was important enough to them to record that it mattered that the people of God followed God. It's a really cool feature of the Israelite histories. Okay, so we have this idea, or we have this exile, this period 586 to 538, where the exile happened. So the Jerusalem fell. The Jews, or this is kind of where the Jews started after exile, but the Israelites who were in the kingdom of Judah, they were sent to Babylon. Most of them went to Babylon and were settled there. Some of them fled to Egypt, and a few of them remained, but not very many. Everything was in ruin, and so they were in exile for a while. And then something incredible happened. They came back. Now, I really like history, so I nerd out on history podcasts. There's this one called Hardcore History by a guy named Dan Carlin. He's great. Very much not a believer. And he did this series called The Kings of Kings, where he looks through the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, and the Persian Empire. And he goes through all of those and kind of tells the stories of that big empire. And there's like 15 hours of content. I recommend it. It's free, I think, right now. Dan Carlin, Hardcore History. He's very much not a believer, so he doesn't take the Bible seriously. And so there are several times where he will quote from the book of Nahum or quote from one of the prophetic books in order to make a point about what people thought of these people. He doesn't take it as in the same way that we would, but that doesn't mean that he's not, we can learn things from his history either way. But he made this point about the Jews returning, where he was like, yeah, and it makes absolutely no sense that, Cyrus, the king of Persia, who sent the Jews back, he really didn't gain anything from this. And the fact that he sent them back is very, the Jewish people, so Judaism and Christianity and Islam, which all flowed from the Abrahamic religion, from this tradition, could have been snuffed out right here in 538. But for some reason, Cyrus decided, sure, whatever, we'll send them back. That's fine. And this guy was explaining it in a very kind of, man, why are, Jews and Muslims fighting? Because look, they have this shared heritage and blah, 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 blah. And it was a very interesting point. But the fact that he recognizes, despite him not recognizing the scriptures in any way, the fact that he recognizes that it could have all ended right here, yet for some reason, chance of history, Cyrus decided to send him back. Now, I, as a man of faith, would look at that and say, well, duh, these people have been claiming that they're special among God's people and that he will return and they claim all these things, and then this happens, and you say, well, that's a coincidence. So, but I won't get into that. But anyways, they return. I just think it's interesting to me, so I'm saying it because I have a captive audience. The temple is rebuilt around 515 here, and this is the second temple, and this begins what's called the Second Temple period. Second Temple Judaism is a word that comes up all the time. This is covered in the book of Ezra, and we have Ezra returning and Nehemiah building the walls. You have all of this stuff going on. And the walls of Jerusalem being rebuilt. Yeah, that's the book of Nehemiah. This covers the book of Ezra. And also the prophet at this time, Malachi, being the prophet at this time. And this ends the Old Testament. Now, what we need to talk about now is perhaps one of the most neglected things in my own education, something that I had to teach myself later in life, but something that I really, really think that we should talk about, and that is the intertestamental period. So Assyrian Empire is going on right here. Assyrian Empire is going on right here. Babylonian Empire is going on right here. Persian Empire is going on right here. Alexander the Great is what's next on the scene. After Cyrus and a bunch of Persian, Artaxerxes and some guys, and battles with the Jews and the Greeks, the Peloponnesian Wars, all that stuff goes on. We have Alexander the Great. Well, his dad, Philip of Macedon, organizes the Macedonians, and then Alexander runs through the world and basically conquers everything east of Greece all the way to India in like 10 years and then dies of malaria at 29. But he was one of the greatest generals of all time. So this happens. And after Alexander died, his 4 generals took over the remains of his empire. He had no time to name an heir or consolidate his empire or anything like that. So his 4 top dogs, 2 of those generals, his 4 top dogs took over all and divided the territory amongst themselves. 2 of those guys were Ptolemy. This is Ptolemy is how you say it, but there's a P in it. So it's Ptolemy and Seleucus. So this became the Ptolemaic Empire and the Seleucid Empire. Now this is where at first Ptolemy controlled Egypt and Palestine, or the Israel area, so Israel, Palestine. So that is where Ptolemy controlled. At this point in the history, there was a war fought between Ptolemy and Seleucus, or actually their children, and Seleucid took over the Palestinian Israel area, and they controlled it all the way up until this Maccabean period right here. Now, I tell you this because it's very important, because when Israel came back, they did not come back as an independent people group that had their own king. They came back as a group as a vassal state to the Persian Empire, who were controlled and ruled by the priests. So the priests were the ruling class at this period of time. They were the ones who made the decisions. They were the ones who communicated with the Persian state back home. Well, then Alexander conquered, so they briefly were under Alexander's administration. And then Ptolemy took over the governance. And so these priests took on the Ptolemaic period, or took on the governance. And so they were paying taxes to the Ptolemies and dealing with that. Well, Ptolemy, during this time, this is what's called the Hellenistic period. And the Hellenistic period is a very important thing. Hellenism, this idea of Greekifying the world, there were two ways to Greekify the world. You can make people attracted to the Greek culture and have them adopt it, or you can force them into it. And the way that you try to make them adopt it is by building theaters and building bathhouses and showing all the great things. And that's what happened in Israel during the Ptolemaic period. There was all these Greek things that were built in Israel. And there's a big decision that Jews had to make. Do they keep their, how much of Hellenism is contrary to the Torah and is contrary to the prophets, and how much of Hellenism makes sense and isn't a big deal and is just something that, like a host of things that are just part of culture that are neither good nor bad. It just depends on how you use them. So they started to see that, okay, they could coexist here. Some people would give up the faith and join the worship Zeus and Apollo and Aphrodite and all of those things and get all the Greek stuff. And then Seleucus came in, and this guy named Antiochus, who is the leader of the Seleucids, decided that this whole Hellenism thing, this whole Israelite religion, this Judaism that it had become, it wasn't going to fly. This circumcision, that was mutilating the body, and in the Hellenistic understanding of the body was sacred, and you're not supposed to mess with the body. Don't defy and defile the body by cutting it. If anyone circumcises their children, we're going to kill the children and the parents. Yeah. This is where what brought on the Maccabean period. And if you ever heard of the book of Maccabees, it's in the Apocrypha, which are books that we Protestants don't consider canon, but it tells us the histories, and this is where we get all of this information. Judas Maccabeus, who is the son of Matthias Maccabeus, they were a family of priests who were in this ruling class, and they said enough is enough. They fought a revolution. A bunch of freedom fighters who said, we're sick of you murdering our children and murdering us for keeping faithful to God's covenant. We're going to fight back, and God is going to fight with us. And it worked. They won. They threw the Greeks out. And the Judas Maccabeus became kind of the dominant ruler, and the Jews had this independent kingdom, and all of the hopes of the promises that God made to David were coming and flowing back in. And this lasted for, if you look at this little scope, very, very short period of time. From 163 to 63, for about 100 years, the Jews had their own control. And really, only about half of that, the Jews actually liked their leaders. Because right after the Maccabeans got power, they basically converted to Hellenism. They basically adopted Greek customs, and they adopted all their children betrayed the revolution. The revolution was about, let's get back, let's be pure, let's follow God, and we'll fight the enemy, and we'll kick them out, and then we'll live faithful to God's Torah. The leaders in power did not really want that. And so they Hellenized and eventually started infighting, and the Romans came in and took over. Couple of really important things. Those priests who were in charge, starting here and moving all the way in, those priests eventually became the Sadducees. They were the ruling classes. They were the wealthy ones. They had the power. Some of it was, all of it was the formal power, where the Romans used the priests. They weren't going to reinvent the wheel. They just let the ruling systems work so long as they paid their taxes, no big deal. So that's the Sadducees. Now, the Maccabeans, they couldn't win alone. They needed some people to fight for them. And so there's this group called the Hasmoneans, who were the pious ones, is how that translates. And they were the faithful to Torah fighters. And those two groups of people became the Zealots and the Pharisees. And so those three groups, the Zealots, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees, all feature heavily in Jesus's birth here in around 4 BC. All of those people, they feature very, very heavily there. And so just kind of knowing that's the origin. The festival of Hanukkah happens in the Maccabean period, and I won't explain that all because I've probably taken too much of our time anyways. But this has been a sketch outline. This is just another way of sort of looking at some of this stuff. But I'm going to go back and stop sharing and talk to you for a second because we need to wrap this up. This has been a sketch outline of sort of the timeline of events of the Old Testament. Um, Obviously, there's a lot more to it and a lot to talk about, and I would love to have conversations with y'all about these things. I'm a history nerd, and so I really enjoy this. But I think it can be helpful for us to learn not only what's going on in Israel, but learn what's going on outside of Israel, because it helps us to understand the motivations of the people involved in the stories. And when we understand those motivations better, we can understand the text better, because the author of the text often assumes that you live in the world that he's writing to. So if I'm writing to you, you should understand that Egypt and Assyria were the two dominant nations around 700 AD or BC. He assumes you know that. When you read the prophets, you assume that you know what nations are around and some of the geography and things like that. I fell in love with the Old Testament over the last 3 years. I've always kind of had an affinity for the prophets, but after really taking a lot of time to study and learn these different people groups and motivations, it helped me to see how similar the Old Testament is to the New Testament. It helped me to see that it's telling the same story, that the same God of grace that spoke through Jesus, that died on the cross for us, is the same God that was speaking through Isaiah, that was speaking through Jeremiah, and they were saying the same things in a different language. Not just Greek versus Hebrew, but talking to a different group of people and using that culture's um, way of knowing and understanding in the world. God is communicating to particular groups of people, and we have to do a little work to understand that. But guys, nothing in life worth anything comes easy. If you want to learn the piano and experience the joy of playing the piano, you have to go through the discipline of practicing the piano. And so if you really want to enjoy the prophets, I think you have to go through the discipline of learning about some of these backgrounds and things like that. And the more that you learn, the more you see, wow, that makes so much sense. I totally would see myself. I would have done the same thing that Jeremiah did there. Or wow, I definitely wouldn't have done the same thing Jeremiah did. Look at who Jeremiah is and how God worked through him here. Or, man, I get where that king is coming from and the way that they're making that decision. That had to have been really hard. Maybe the Israelites weren't just a bunch of people who constantly hated God. Maybe if I was among them, I probably would have done the exact same thing if I understood the pressures that they were facing. Maybe I should have some grace for them too. All of these things can help us just really access and understand the story better. I hope you enjoyed this. If not, well, you can watch it on double speed. I didn't tell you that at the beginning. I told you that at the end. But again, I hope you enjoy service, and I look forward to being back with you soon. If you ever want to talk history, shoot me an email. Come to Christianity 101. This is kind of stuff that we enjoy talking about, and we'll sketch through from time to time. You guys have a wonderful, wonderful morning. Love you all, and I will talk to you later.